Good morning, Mr. Darcy. It's time to do some artwork today. You ready? Okay, let's get some artwork done. Hello, and welcome on in. I'm Viv. This is Art with Viv. If we haven't met, this week we are going to be doing a rooster with watercolor. And for my beginners, as I go along, as I always do, I'm going to be giving you tips. For my not so beginners, I hope that this is still helpful to you and that you learn something. Mr. Darcy's ready to go. He's underneath my desk sleeping. So let's just get to painting. Let's go to the studio. So I've transferred my drawing onto some 140-pound hot pressed, so it's smooth, watercolor paper. And I'm using a piece out of a block from Artistico Fabriano, an Artistico block. I've mixed up a nice burnt umber with a nice indigo, and I'm using that for black. Now you can use a tube black. I just find it's a little bit flat for me, and that's what I'm using for the pupil. And there's a dark shadow right at the top of his beak, and then of course the shadow that separates the upper portion of his beak from the lower portion. I'm using that same color for all of those areas, getting in the really darkest dark. Now notice on the pupil I did leave some of the white of the paper shining through right at the top because that's where the highlight is on his eye. I also did a really watery wash of the pale gray right on the top part of his beak, right underneath that really dark shadow. Then I went ahead and got some of the warm red, the warm yellow, and the cool yellow, which is lemon, and just sort of mixing those together and putting just a tiny bit of burnt sienna in that warm red just to darken it up some. He has some really pretty coloring on his beak. And I'm just trying to use the reference photo as a guide. I'm not trying to paint it exactly. I'm not a Xerox machine. I don't want you to be a Xerox machine. Just use it as a guide and do your version of it. So I'm also doing that while that gray, that really pale wash of gray is still wet. And I am letting some of that yellow just sort of blend right at the edge. It'll be a nice soft blend. So we won't have a hard edge when the yellow sort of blends into the gray. But I am keeping that gray really pale for his iris of his eye, the colored part of his eye. I've got the really warm red color, and I'm just painting around that black pupil. Remember to let that pupil dry completely before you paint the iris in, or else they will bleed together. You don't want that. So just make sure that your pupil is dry. And then I've mixed together some of the warm red with a little bit of that alizarin crimson, which is a cool red. And now I'm just doing texture. I'm just doing dots down. I think that's called a wattle. You know, down the little red part that hangs off of his chin. And you see I just did little dots, and then right around the edge I put in some of that black mixture while it was a little bit wet, and then I also put in some of that orange, that brownish orange as well, and just let it blend into that red. And now I'm working back on the beak. I've done a little bit more of the gray wash, watery gray color, and let that all blend together. I'm putting in some of that darker brown underneath on the bottom half of his beak. And now I'm just mixing up a little bit more of that red, and all I'm doing is mixing the alizarin crimson with that cadmium red hue. And it gives you more of a neutral red, more of a true red when you mix them both together. And he has the red ring around his eye, and it's really bumpy. So I just did little tiny dots with the tip of my brush, and I'm coming down on his wattle, and where his wattle has some shadows, I am just adding a little bit more of that mixture right on top. And I'm letting some of those dots kind of shine through. This is called glazing. When you lay down a color, let it dry, and then you put another color over it. You can usually see, if the color is transparent enough, you can usually see that initial layer through it. So I'm still getting the texture, but I'm also getting the shadow. Now I've added a little bit more blue into that black mixture, and I've mixed it with my red, and that's alizarin crimson that I'm mixing it with, and that's going to be my shadow color. He has a lot of folds and a lot of different angles and curves to his wattle, and I hope I'm saying the right word. down on his red thing that hangs under his chin. So I'm getting those in there, and that's what I'm using as my shadow color, is just some alizarin crimson mixed with that black mixture. Again, I am doing like just tapping on the paper, letting a lot of the white of the paper shine through just to give the texture, because the texture on that red skin is really bumpy. And there's a lot of white highlights on it and a lot of pink, and then you have your shadows. Then right along the edge, I'm coming back in with that blackish mixture and a little bit of brown, because he has some coloring there, some markings right on the edge of each side of his wattle, and I'm just getting those in there. Again, you can still see that I'm just tapping the brush and letting a little bit of that white shine through. Now, if you want the exact colors and the reference photo along with an outline drawing, become a patron. It starts at $3 a month. You get all kinds of bonus content related to my YouTube videos every week, so it's worth the $3 that's the start, but I have different tiers. So you might want to look into that, and I will link that below. So now I'm coming back in. I've waited for all of that to dry, and I took some of that black mixture and I went right around the ring of his iris, and that separates it from that red fleshy area, and that gives it a good separation. Again, wait for it to completely dry before you come back in with that really fine line of black, because it'll bleed if you don't. So now I've got that shadow color going again, that deep purpley red shadow color right where his skin folds are. And then I'm lightening it up with a little bit of water as I come down where the light is shining in there. It's still in shadow, so it's not as bright red as the rest of the flesh, but it is a little bit lighter. So I am just letting the white of the paper be my white. I'm coming down in there with a more watery mixture. Then along that edge where the light is hitting it, it is more red, so I'm using a little bit more of that red mixture, and that was just the cadmium red with a little bit of the alizarin crimson. That gives us more of the true red. And now I'm coming back in with just more of the alizarin crimson down at the bottom. I want to have some different variations and tones of red in here. It gives it more interest. You might even want to put some of that I'm calling it orange, but it's actually a warm yellow, or you could mix that warm yellow with that warm red and get a really beautiful orange and mix that in there, and we'll do that later on. I'll show you that. Right now I'm just trying to go by the lightness and darkness, and for the darker areas, of course, I'm using more alizarin crimson with a little bit of that black mixture, which is just blue and brown, to get a shadowy color. Putting in those shadows, paying really close attention to where they are on the reference photo. And again, my patrons, they will get that. They will get the reference photo. So now I'm coming in with a little bit of the orangey, a more orange red. So I'm just using that warm yellow along with that cadmium red to get a nice orange. I am doing it in a really wet, thin wash across and let some of that white of the paper shine through. And then I'm just taking a little bit of the darker red and just doing some texture in there while it's still wet. It'll be really soft, but you'll still be able to see those little dots and to make it look bumpy once it is dry. So now I'm going in with a little bit more orange on his cheek. I've added a little bit more orange and a little bit more of that warmer red with just a little tiny bit of the alizarin crimson, and it makes a much brighter red, a much cleaner red. Now I'm just coming in with that warm yellow and letting it blend together with that red, and that gives it more of a warm orangey look almost. And we're going to go above his eye and just get in all those areas that are really bright, really light and bright. And the way that we're getting that brightness is by adding just some of that warm yellow. And there's a little shadow right here toward the corner of his eye. I did that with a little bit of that darker alizarin crimson blue and brown mixture. Then right around his beak, right where his beak sort of attaches to his cheek, it's more of a paler, brighter red. So I'm going in there with some oranges first, just to brighten that up. Coming in with a little bit of the darker red right here to the corner and right under his eye and a little bit over his eye. And that just gives it some definition. And like I said, I'm trying to get like different shades of red. It makes it more interesting. It makes it more visually appealing. So always, think about that. I've added a little bit more blue to that mixture. So I'm adding in some more shadows and really separating the eyeball from that pink flesh that rings his eye. Well, it's pinkish red. So now his eye is really defined by using that really dark color. Now I'm just wetting that orange area and lifting some of that pigment. So all I did was I wet it a little bit and then I wiped my brush off so my brush was damp dry, and then lifted the pigment and wiped it onto the paper towel. So now I'm going in with a deeper sort of yellow ochre with a little bit of that burnt sienna and burnt umber. First I did like the yellow ochre and just did sort of feathery marks, and now I'm coming back in with the darker, deeper brown, which was just burnt sienna with burnt umber mixed together, and putting that on while it's wet so it'll sort of softly blend around the edges. There won't be a lot of harsh lines, some hard edges. We don't want those. Then for his comb, I did the same thing. I mixed sort of a neutralish red with the cadmium red and the alizarin crimson, and now I'm just doing tiny like dots. I'm just doing sort of a scumbling technique with my brush, just doing dots randomly, letting plenty of the white of the paper shine through. Actually, on the tip of some of his comb, the points of his combs, it's almost completely white in the reference photo, but I'm leaving a lot of those white areas shining through as highlights. And then he has some dark markings on his comb, so I'm just going, while it's still wet, I'm just going in there and mixing up a little brown and a little bit of the indigo and just doing a little bit darker dots here and there. And now I am just coming in onto his beak where the shadows are and darkening up those shadows, just putting another glaze of that same color over those shadows to darken them up. And in the deeper shadows on his wattle, I'm doing that same thing. I'm putting that deeper reddish brown bluish mixture. It's just indigo blue, burnt umber, and alizarin, and just putting that in all of the darker places where it needs to be. Now I am coming in and with just some burnt sienna, I'm just going to do his feathers, neck feathers. Now that was supposed to be a white area, and I just totally painted over the white. His ear is covered with some white feathers, and yes, chickens have ears, and that is his ear where I dabbed that color back out, and it's supposed to be white. If you look, if you have the reference photo, if you're one of my patrons, his ear feathers that cover his ear are white. So I made a mistake and I just dabbed it up with a paper towel before it dried. Now I'm adding some of that darker mixture where he has the shadows, and just coming in with some yellow ochre and a little bit of burnt sienna in the lighter areas. And I'm just going straight onto dry paper. That's just called wet on dry technique if you're new to watercolor. And while it's still wet, which is wet on wet technique, while that paint is still wet, I'm adding some of the darker browns and really deep rich tones where the shadows are, and that's just adding a lot more burnt umber to it to make it really deep. His wattle is casting a shadow on his chest, plus he does have some black feathers mixed in with his sort of golden brown feathers, so I'm just sort of trying to imitate that, what I see. I'm not copying it exactly. I am just trying to get the idea of it and use my reference as a guide. And meanwhile, his comb is drying, everything on his face is drying, so we can do some detail work on that at the end, but I'm letting it dry first, and while it's drying, I'm coming in here and just doing my feather work. And I'm just using the wet on wet technique where I put the wet paint down first and then come back in with more wet paint on top of it so that it blends together. Now I'm going to come in here where there are some shadows on his comb, his little comb on top of his head. I'm just coming in and doing this little, still that scumbling stroke, but it's also glazing that same color over the initial wash, which makes it darker. That's one way to make your watercolors darker, is you can just glaze over them either with the same color or a complementary color. In this instance, I'm choosing to use the same color because I want that comb to stay bright and red. I really love it. And actually, I kind of like this painting without a background, but as you see, I go ahead and put a background on as we go in further. And now some of these areas, I'm just putting like a really, really thin glaze of that reddish mixture and covering over some of those really white highlights so that they're more pink. It just sort of subdues those. I don't want them all to be so bright white. They're too white. And I'm adding more shadow in those areas where there is some dark shadows. But I don't want him to go too dark on his comb because his comb is up there in the light. The sun is hitting directly on it, so it is going to be a lot brighter than his wattle down below, because his wattle, his face is sort of shading it, and it has so many folds that those folds create a lot of shadow. So now I'm just going to come in and put in even more of his feathers, and I'm trying to do the up and down strokes. I am following the way that his feathers grow out of his skin. They go up and down. I'm not going horizontal with them. That would look dumb and it wouldn't look realistic. Your eye would say, oh, that's not how a chicken's feathers grow. They don't grow from side to side. They grow from top to bottom. So that's what I'm doing. I'm also mixing in some of the bright yellow in with that, a little bit of the burnt umber, a little bit of yellow ochre. Now I wet underneath his eye, that little ridge under his eye, and now I'm just taking my brush and picking up some of that pigment just to lighten that area. Again, that's called lifting. That's how you lighten an area. You can do it while it's still wet and lift off excess paint, or you can let it dry and then re-wet it and lift it off, as long as the color's not too staining. If it's a staining color, you'll have a little bit harder time lifting it. Now I've decided to go with a background, but looking at it now, I wish I had just left the background white, but I went ahead and got that sort of warm blue, and I'm just going straight onto the dry paper, and I'm not being real fussy about it. I'm not trying to get like a smooth, even wash. I want a little bit of texture behind him. I want that texture to sort of echo his feathers and the way that they're sort of patchy, not patchy, but you know, they're not all uniform in one flat color. They have some gradation and some variations. So I've switched to my 1/2 inch flat brush, and I mixed some of that warm blue with a little bit of that dark mixture that we were using for the black, some of that indigo and burnt umber, and I'm just going right around the very edge. Now it's still wet. I put in that really light wash of the blue first, and now I'm just coming back in while it's still wet and adding another layer that's just a tiny bit darker, because I put a little bit more of that indigo and a little bit more of that umber into that warm blue mixture. And I'm just going around my chicken. Now most people do their backgrounds first, but I like to break the rules, so I'm doing my background last. And I want you to experiment and figure out which way works best for you. But most people do put their background on first. I have a tendency to put it on last when it's just a single subject that I'm painting. Now, if this was a more complicated subject that had all different kinds of elements in it, I would definitely do the background first. But since this is just one element, just one subject, then it's really easy just to put the background in last. And I also can leave a little thin line margin of the white of the paper shining through, and that helps pop out the chicken from the background. So now I'm just adding a little bit more of the red into some of the places to darken it up. Again, that's called glazing, when you put another wash over a dry wash, and it can be the same a wash of the same color or of a different color. It just depends. If you do it of a different color, you can actually change the color, your initial color. So there's different things that glazing is good for, but for this I'm just darkening up some of the shadows, and I want it to stay bright and red, so I'm using the same exact color. And we're done, and I hope you've enjoyed this. That was so simple. Thank you for watching, and a big shout out to my patrons. Thank y'all so much for your support.